Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz. I am a big opponent of the war on drugs for moral reasons, because I think human beings have the right to ingest whatever they would like to ingest into their own bodies, but also because I just think that the government is woefully incompetent when it comes to regulating that kind of stuff. And today's guest actually wrote a very good article, so I decided to have him on. He is a surgeon who is also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and he works in the Department of Health Policy Studies. Jeffrey A. Singer, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So to start with, tell us about this recent FDA. I don't know if it's a finding or a decision or what, but they've recently come out and said some things about a commonly used decongestant. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, the FDA advisory board did. The FDA is yet to make a decision about
Oh, okay.
So phenylephrine is available in nasal spray, injectable, and oral form. And the nasal spray is called neosynephrine. You might have heard of that. It's a pretty common name. And the way it's supposed to work is it causes blood vessels to constrict. And when you spray it into your nose, it causes the blood vessels in the nasal passages to constrict, which reduces the production of mucus and helps decongest you. We also use it, by the way, in the operating room. Sometimes when we have a patient in shock, we give it intravenously and raise their blood pressure if they're in shock. Anyway, it was made available orally in over-the-counter decongestants dating back to before the 70s. And in the mid-1970s, the FDA had a review of oral decongestants containing phenylephrine, and their advisory panel concluded, yeah, it looks like it's safe and effective. Since 1962, the FDA will not approve a drug just on the basis of it being safe. It has to be deemed safe and effective. That was the 1962 amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Up until then, it was just had to be safe, and then clinicians and patients will make a decision whether or not it's effective. And of course, that delayed the release of a lot of products because you have to do all these efficacy tests. So anyway, since the mid 70s, it's been deemed safe and effective. And then in 2007, a couple of academic pharmacists at the University of Florida Pharmacy School did a Freedom of Information Act request, and they looked at the studies that were used to approve oral phenylephrine, and they concluded on the basis of these studies that these were very poor, weak studies, and it was wrongly decided, and they asked for another review. And another review was ordered by the FDA, and it kind of swept a lot of the weak findings under the rug and said, yeah, it is probably effective. So it's been around since, it's been considered safe and effective ever since the 70s. On September 12th, again, because of these two academics, plus the American Pharmacy Association and a lot of other organizations, they did yet another review, and they concluded unanimously, the FDA advisory panel concluded unanimously, this doesn't work orally. And the reason is that when you take phenylephrine orally, your stomach and intestinal juices break it down, so it doesn't work. When you take it topically on the nasal passages or intravenously, it works. So they just reported this on September 12th, and the FDA has to decide what to do. The interesting thing to me is, if you look at some of the history, by the way, there's an interesting article in time.com by Haley Weiss that really goes over the history of this. Is very, and she takes no position. She just recounts the history. And then in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, September 18th, Alicia Finley wrote a piece about it. And she also, both of them sort of talked around this issue. But here's a little bit more history. So around the turn of this century, there were three oral decongestants that were on the market. There was pseudoephedrine, or Sudafed is the brand name, phenylpropanolamine. I don't want to get too technical here, and what did I just say?
You said pseudo. I would say
Yeah,
pseudoephedrine, but you called it pseudoephedrine.
pseudoephedrine, yeah,
Pseudoephedrine.
and phenylpropanolamine, in addition to the neosynephrine.
Okay, hold
So
on, hold, because I definitely want to get into the pseudoephedrine because I think that's a very
yeah,
interesting part of the story. But a lot of people count on the FDA. They trust the FDA. They think that that's the sine qua non of judgment when it comes to food, drugs, and other things. Why did it take them so long to discover that this wasn't an effective
well,
product?
most of the critics are saying they're just a bumbling bureaucratic agency, but I think there's a lot of politics involved too. Because whenever you have and the argument I've been making is whenever you have a government monopoly that this makes all the decisions as to what people can put into their body, it's up
Yeah.
to that government monopoly. I think it's naive not to assume it won't be subjected to political pressures.
Oh, sure.
In fact,
Sure.
a classic example is Plan B, the morning after pill. It was approved by an advisory panel in 1999, and it wasn't made legal in this country for over-the-counter use until for all ages. It took until 2013 and a court order for it to finally be approved by the FDA for over-the-counter use for women of all ages, and it was available in Europe for years. Why do you think that is? Well, there are a lot of social conservative groups that didn't like the idea that they thought it would encourage sexual promiscuity, and they basically wanted to use the power of the state to meddle into people's personal choices. So this is nothing new. So here's what I was getting to: is by the turn of the century, there were three main oral decongestants: phenylephrine, neosynephrine is this nasal spray, phenylpropanolamine, and pseudoephedrine. Well, around 2000, we were learning that there was some cardiological side effects and with the use of phenylpropanolamine. So it was the manufacturers stopped marketing it because there were too many reports. People were having some strokes too. So that left us with pseudoephedrine and phenylephrine. Then we had the so-called meth crisis. We all remember that, with the frying pan, this is your brain on drugs and all that. And in 2005, Congress passed the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act, which took effect in 2006. And among the things it did was first of all, it had the DEA require all pseudoephedrine containing products move behind the counter. And put strict requirements. If you wanted to purchase it, you had to give them your driver's license. The pharmacist had to register you. There was a limited amount you can obtain per month, and you'd be tracked. So if you go to another store to buy it, they could see that you bought it at another store, because pseudoephedrine was used by a lot of local homegrown meth labs. Anybody can go on YouTube and see how to do it. And if you have a basic chemistry background, you could use it as an ingredient to make methamphetamine. So the idea, the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act, moved that behind the counter. So since we're not using phenylpropanolamine and pseudoephedrine is behind the counter, then if people don't want to go through the hassle and the stigma, even when they buy pseudoephedrine, they wonder, are you looking at me like I'm I operate a meth lab or something like that?
Yeah.
So it became much more convenient for manufacturers of decongestants to just switch out a lot of their products to have phenylephrine hydrochloride, because that was not behind the counter, that was in front. Okay, so for example, if people were used to getting Sudafed, which is the brand of pseudoephedrine, you could also see over the counter Sudafed PE, which stands for phenylephrine. So even though it has the name Sudafed, it's really fake Sudafed. It's phenylephrine hydrochloride. And most of those over-the-counter decongestants contain phenylephrine hydrochloride. Now, interestingly, the government didn't do this, but again, here we go with the private sector. So Shearing Plow at the time, which was the maker of Claritin D, now it's owned by Merck, they included pseudoephedrine in their anti-allergic medication that's non-drowsy, Claritin, Okay. And they ran their own internal tests to see if they substituted out phenylephrine for pseudoephedrine in their Claritin D, will that work? And they concluded no, it makes it ineffective. So we're going to keep it behind it. We'll just take our chances because we're going to bank on people wanting our products so badly that they'll go give their ID and all that. So they didn't change out Claritin D to a version that had phenylephrine instead of Sudafed. And the makers of Zyrtec and Allegra, they followed suit. Okay. So this is interesting because this wasn't the FDA. These are private pharmaceutical companies that did their own tests and said, I don't think phenylephrine works orally. So let's just take our chances and keep it behind the counter. So in 2007, when these academic pharmacists from the University of Florida brought to the attention of the FDA, hey, those studies that you used to approve this back in the 1970s, they were horrible studies. I think you should do some more studies. They kind of had they organized a panel, and it was very slipshod, and they basically said, yeah, it's probably good. And they basically ignored these guys until finally in 2000, I think it was 2015, the same group, as well as the American Pharmacy Association, again demanded that comparative effectiveness studies be done. And this is the study we see now, September 12th, that shows it doesn't work. So I argue, of course, it's going to be impossible to prove this, but in 2007, when it was first brought to the FDA's attention that the studies upon which they claimed that oral phenylephrine works were crappy studies, they didn't want to hear that, because if they take phenylephrine hydrochloride off the market. Now, I would argue, of course, they shouldn't be able to do that. They should just announce to people, by the way, this doesn't work. You're free to buy it if you want. That's what I would argue. But by taking it off the market, then a whole bunch of people are going to be really ticked off, because they're going to say, well, why do I have to go? Now I got to go every time I want to get an effective oral decongestant. I got to go give my ID and be treated like I'm some sort of criminal. So it was better, in my opinion, just to pretend you don't hear this, because you're otherwise undermining the efforts of the DEA to carry out the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act by making it harder for people to get pseudoephedrine. Now, there's a second side to this story, and that's the drug war story.
Well, hold on. So
Yeah.
pseudoephedrine actually works.
Yeah, very
Right.
effective. Yeah.
So it actually works. But now
orally,
yes. But now we have a difficulty if we want to get it. Now, you said something that got me thinking about these government regulatory bureaus when you said that they're basically subject to being bought and paid for. It's possible a regulatory capture once you have a company that, a administration that can regulate things, the people that are regulated will seek to gain favor with it. It's what happens. And I was just thinking about my girlfriend used to sell homemade soaps, and she was telling me about how difficult it was with all the regulations to sell soap. And she said one of the things she couldn't do was say, this will clean you. Like, she couldn't make that claim because the FDA wouldn't let her. And I'm thinking, well, what difference does it make? If you say it'll clean you and someone buys it and they don't feel clean, they won't buy it anymore. If they like it, they'll keep buying it. But the very fact that you can't say it, now when people go to buy something like that, they're like, oh, wait a second, it doesn't say it can even clean you. And they don't realize it's because of these organizations, right? And now, speaking of ineffectiveness, this I think is where you were going. If it's not, then you can go where you were going anyway. But what I want to know is, has it actually decreased meth use or made meth any less deadly?
That's where I was going.
Now that we can't get the pseudoephedrine.
Yeah, that's where I was going with this. Well, but first of all, you're right about regulatory capture. In this case, I would think it's not regulatory capture so much as it's basically falling prey to political pressures, just for the same reason that it took 13 years to approve Plan B for over-the-counter because of political forces. I would argue that that's why they didn't want to hear that oral phenylephrine doesn't work, because the DEA is trying to get people to take it because they don't want them to buy pseudoephedrine. We don't want to undermine what they're doing. That's what I think. I can't prove that, but it certainly makes sense, or at least it needs to be on a list of possible explanations. So what happened? So first of all, it got harder for us to get pseudoephedrine. Also, a lot of the parts of the Combat Methamphetamine Act funded a lot of SWAT teams breaking in on these local homegrown meth labs, and it opened up a whole new market for the Mexican drug cartels, who at the time there was so many local homegrown meth labs that they really wasn't a profitable market for them to enter. But now it was, because a lot of competition was cleared out of the way by the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act. So, and it didn't take long for them to figure out that there are much more efficient ways to make much more potent methamphetamine, formulations of methamphetamine. And anybody who's watched the award-winning series Breaking Bad, which I highly recommend, it's fantastic. You'll know it. You'll see it. One of the most common chemical components is called phenyl-2-propanone, or it's also called phenylacetone, or P2P. And it's an industrial chemical, and you can make just huge quantities very easily. And that's what they call the iron law of prohibition. The harder the law enforcement, the harder the drug. So it incentivizes the drug dealers to come up with more efficient and potent forms of the product that they're going to smuggle, so they can smuggle it in smaller sizes and get more and subdivide into more units for sale, because it's more potent, if they're going to take the risk. And that's why, they didn't smuggle in beer and wine during alcohol prohibition. They smuggled in whiskey. So you had what I argued in my blog post last week is you had this like double whammy. You had one organization that was going to try to combat the methamphetamine epidemic. And so as a result, between 2006 and 2021, methamphetamine related overdoses increased 1,500%. Okay, that's how well it combated the methamphetamine. It gave the Mexican cartels a whole new, market opportunity, and they quickly discovered that you don't need to waste your time emptying these little Sudafed capsules. It's a pain in the butt. Let's just get these giant, vats of P2P and make it industrially. So that's how well that worked. And in the meantime, while that's going on, the FDA is basically misleading the general public into thinking, or not letting them know, that oral phenylephrine doesn't work. So not only are they wasting their money all these years on something that doesn't work, because they're not letting them know this, but they're also that people aren't getting good relief, because they don't want to get the thing that works because it's behind the counter. So they're making them waste their money and not get good relief. So you had these two different government agencies combined to screw everybody over. And to me, I mean, that's just a typical story of government regulation. And the interesting thing is that the private company like Shearing Plow that makes Claritin D, they figured it out. They didn't need the government to do it for them. They did their own research and said, you know what, we're sticking with keeping pseudoephedrine in our product because the phenylephrine doesn't work. So they, of course, nobody knew that because the FDA didn't say that. And the FDA has a monopoly on this information.
Now, you called it the iron law of prohibition, which suggests to me that this isn't a one-off. This sort of thing has happened before. I'd like to hear what are some cases where government prohibition have actually made the drug worse or more dangerous or created more addictive substances, whatever, where this iron law of prohibition has been in effect?
Okay, well, first of all, there are in the legal world, there are real life examples. The iron law of prohibition is the term that was coined in the 1980s by a drug policy writer, but it's really a variation of what economists call the Alkene-Allen effect. It's a technical term. Don't ask me any more about that. I'm not an economist. But basically, if you're going to take risks, then you need to learn ways to make whatever it is that you're smuggling to make it more potent, so you can smuggle it in smaller sizes and it's easier to sneak by. And also, when you go through all those risks and you get to the other side, that little bit that you snuck by, you could subdivide into more units because it's more powerful. So again, it makes it worth your while. So a real life example, is football games. When people are tailgating outside the stadium, they're drinking beer and wine, and at the football game. But you're not allowed to bring any alcohol into the stadium. So they're not smuggling in beer and wine. They're smuggling in these little flasks, the hard stuff. Okay, that's the Iron Law of Prohibition. But during alcohol prohibition, they were smuggling in whiskey. They weren't smuggling in, beer and wine. And of course, the opioid-related overdose crisis is a classic example. During the early part of this century, the most popular drugs for people who wanted to use non-medically, recreational users, was what the DEA calls diverted. Diverted means it got out of the legal market into the black market. Diverted prescription pain pills. And there were stories abound in college campuses. It was very common where kids will get a hold of some oxycodone or something like that. And that was the most popular drug to use. And as a doctor, I could tell you that, well, if you're going to do that, that's probably your best choice, because if it says oxycodone 5 milligrams, it's going to be oxycodone 5 milligrams.
Exactly.
It comes from a pharmaceutical company, and it's not going to be adulterated with anything. But then as the prohibitionists decided that the overdose crisis was due to the pharmaceutical companies and to doctors overtreating people in pain, which is not what it was. And I've written about that. I can talk about that if you want later.
Sure.
But so they clamped down on doctors and arrested doctors because I wrote a white paper on this with Trevor Burrus called Cops Practicing Medicine, which I encourage people to read, and talks about how since the 1914 with the Harrison Narcotics Acts, cops have been increasingly intruding themselves into the practice of medicine. So cops would bust in with a SWAT team at a doctor's office because they've been tracking, and he's been prescribing too many oxycodone pills. And of course, you need to have a SWAT team with a bulletproof vests and helmets, because doctors are always armed and dangerous. If there was a cartel headquarters you're going to bust in on, you just don't go there because you can get hurt. But if you're going to go into a doctor's office, you make sure you're busting in full, all your weapons, showing and all that, and invite the local TV cameras to watch you guys doing that. So because these doctors are, they're dangerous. They usually whip out their semi-automatic and just start firing at the cops, right? I mean, that's in medical school. In medical school, they train us on how to shoot cops. It's part of you can't graduate until you learn how to do that. Anyway,
hey, wait a second. This might not be something to joke about. What's that little hammer that you do the patellar reflex with? They might be whipping those things.
Yeah, right. You never really, they can, if you know how to use it right, you can hit them right between the eyes. Anyway, so as now doctors are afraid to treat people for pain, and people are going under medicated for pain. Some people who are chronically been on pain medicine, which has worked for them, suddenly they're getting cut off. A lot of them are desperately turning to the black market, but also all of the non-medical users who liked to use diverted pain pills, there were no more diverted pain pills. So by around, I think it was 2010 or so, the cartels started filling the void with heroin. So then heroin, and you can watch on these charts from the CDC, you can see like the prescription overdose deaths due to diverted prescription pain pills sort of leveling off. And then they started getting eclipsed by heroin. And then as they cracked down further, around 2012, the cartels figured that you could add a little bit of fentanyl to the heroin, and they would smuggle it in. A lot of times it was popular to put it like in these little balloons, and you could tie it in a knot, and you could stick it inside your cheeks or body cavities. If you put fentanyl in it, it greatly enhances its potency. So it was, at first, fentanyl was getting mixed in with the heroin. Then it really took off during the pandemic, because in order to make heroin, first you got to get the opium poppy. The opiates, opiates, that's from the natural plant. Codeine and morphine are derived from the opium poppy. To make heroin, which is diacetyl morphine, you take the morphine from the opium poppy and you treat it with acetic anhydride, an industrial chemical, and add these acetyl molecules to it and make it into heroin. So first you got to get the opium poppy. That sometimes requires, transporting things across borders. You had all these border closures because of the pandemic. Then you got to get the acetic anhydride. And there were literally supply chain issues with that. So the cartels figured, you know what, let's just substitute out fentanyl, because the main ingredient for fentanyl is piperidine, which is very abundant. It's used for just a whole bunch of things. So, and we don't need to rely on growing and shipping things. We could just make it in a lab like meth. So they started substituting out fentanyl so that by halfway through the pandemic, almost all the drugs coming into the country were pure fentanyl or fentanyl analogs, but they weren't. Heroin disappeared. And a lot of there's been studies done. Dr. Daniel Cicerone at UCSF Medical School, he did a study for the NIH called the Heroin in Transition Study, where it's almost like an anthropologic study. They went out on the street and talked to people who were users. This is around 2019, and they were learning. The users were not thrilled that they were getting fentanyl because apparently it's a completely different experience than the heroin. It's more short acting, and it's what they call bold and brash, whereas heroin is warm and fuzzy. These are their words. But you take what you can get in the black market, right? So that's what happened. And then over time, a lot of people who had been heroin users just got used to using fentanyl. And now we hear about Tranq. You probably heard about that, TRANQ.
Yeah, not much, but I heard a little bit about it.
That's the iron law. So there's a veterinary tranquilizer called xylazine, XYLAZINE, and vets use it all the time to help anesthetize their patients to perform procedures. So it's now being added in to the fentanyl because it potentiates it. It makes it more potent. It's like mixing Valium with an opioid, for example. What's worse is that although there's one study just came out like last week that suggests that if you give enough naloxone, it may actually reverse the xylazine. But up until then, we've thought that naloxone doesn't work to reverse the xylazine because it's not an opioid and doesn't bind with the same receptors. So you're seeing, particularly in the East Coast, is inundated with this. But now a recent report from DEA said that 40% of fentanyl seized by the DEA has xylazine in it. And you see these people like they're almost in a coma. They're just so deep. Also, if when you inject it, if it gets outside of the veins, it causes severe constriction of the vessels, enough to cause the tissue to die. And then a lot of these people are getting these ulcerations that become infected. And there have been some cases where it's gotten so bad people have had to have amputations to save their lives from the sepsis from the infected.
Is that similar to cellulitis?
Yeah. Well, except it's worse. Cellulitis is when the tissue is kind of inflamed and red. This is with an ulcer as well and draining pus. And so that's Tranq, and that's the latest chapter. But there's something coming right behind that. I've written about this too, called nitazene, Nitazene, which is a synthetic opioid like fentanyl. It was developed by Ciba Geigy in the 1950s. But they never brought it to market. It's believed to be about 20% more potent than fentanyl. One version of it is called isotonitrozine, and users call it ISO. And starting around 2019 in Europe and in the US, they were starting to see in toxicology studies evidence that some of these overdose deaths contained isotonitrozine. And in fact, exactly 1 year ago, the Tennessee Department of Health reported that the percentage of cases where they were finding isotonitrozine in their overdose toxicology studies had quadrupled since 2019. Most labs in the country are not testing for it because it just hasn't gotten on anybody's radar screen. So for all we know, it's actually more prevalent than we realize. But that's the next one. And what I've argued and what people who deal with drug policy argue is this is a law, okay? It's like an economic law. You can't stop it. All you're going to do I testified before the House Judiciary Committee subcommittee on crime and government surveillance back in March. And I said, the more you double down on what you're doing, the more you're guaranteeing there'll be something even stronger right after this one. And you're actually just increasing the number of people who are going to be dying. And look, a perfect example was the combat methamphetamine epidemic. How did that work out? So between 2006, when it took effect, and now, 1,500% increase in methamphetamine-related overdoses. And in the meantime, the people who want to use Sudafed have to get this fake Sudafed.
Yeah.
You know? And the FDA doesn't want to hear that it doesn't work. And that's what I'm saying. You got to be I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but to me, I don't think it's a coincidence that the FDA was kind of not wanting to look into this very much.
Well, the problem is they're both corrupt and incompetent, and it's hard to figure out which
Yeah.
one in which
Yeah.
scenario.
Yeah. Is it corruption or incompetence, or maybe a little bit of each?
You mentioned something that ever since I came across it a few years ago, has fascinated me. And it's the idea that these war on drugs make drugs more dangerous because, like you said, so if I go to the store and I want to buy Claritin or I want to buy Congestant, I don't even know if that's still on the market, but whatever. I know what's in it. I know the milligrams. I can read a label. It's fine. But I used to do drugs. I'm going, when I think back on it, like what the hell was going through my head? I'm going to these neighborhoods, meeting people I don't know and I'm never going to see again. And I'm buying these packages off them. And then I'm ingesting this stuff into my body. I don't know what they've cut it with.
Right.
I don't know anything. But so if you're good, it's so logical. If you're buying a substance and you don't know what's in it, what's the dosage, you're risking your chance of getting sick or dying from it. And that's what happens with a fentanyl. You don't know when fentanyl's in it, how much fentanyl's in it, or even what the dosage is of the original heroin or the whatever opiate it happens to be mixed with. It's basically a crapshoot. And so many people just don't seem to get it. And they keep advocating, no, drugs have to be illegal. They're too dangerous.
Right. And that's why I've said the war on drugs is really a war on people. It's just making people who are wanting to ingest a substance, it's making them have to go underground for it where it's more dangerous. And so it's actually putting them at risk. In addition to that, and that, not to mention all of the crime and corruption issues and the violence.
Sure.
For example, when the makers of, let's say, Jack Daniels has a marketing dispute with another maker of a Tennessee whiskey, they go to court. But you can't do that when it's illegal, so you just have to have your people go by the other guy's people and shoot them out.
Sure.
And of course, you have to pay off the cops and pay off the DAs and everything else and the politicians. So it brings out the worst in everything. I mean, people have very short memories. This was all going on during alcohol prohibition. Al Capone was a two-bit thug who became like the mayor of Chicago, the king of Chicago, because of alcohol prohibition. And everybody was on the take. And how many times we hear stories about, law enforcement arresting somebody for possession of drugs, and then they go and sell it. So, that's separate from the fact that you're actually putting human beings at greater risk.
When I was 21 years old, I was selling heroin and crack cocaine, and my house got raided. In my attic, I had 150 dime bags of crack cocaine, and they were all together, so it wasn't like they were separate. And when I got the results of the warrant, it said that they found 19 bags of crack cocaine. And I wasn't going to go argue and say, hey, where's my other
right. Well, the rest was for them, right?
Yeah, but it didn't disappear. It went somewhere. But it's true about the crime stuff, because if I own a package store or whatever, a restaurant, and somebody comes and threatens me or somebody robs me, I can call the police. If I'm a drug dealer and somebody tries to put the squeeze on me or rob me, I don't have that option. I can either give up or get into a war with whomever it is. And I mean, we see that writ large, and yet it just continues and continues. Now, this is outside why I originally wanted to have you on, but now that I have you here, I've got to ask you, because you alluded to it earlier. And that's the idea that it was overprescribing of opiates that led to an opioid epidemic. Now, from what I understand, and I haven't studied it in depth, but it's very rare for somebody to be prescribed, say, OxyContin or Percocet or Tylenol 3 for an injury and then become hooked on it. Is that
Correct.
true? How often does that occur?
Actually, there have been studies on it. And first of all, let's use the government's own data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. Has been conducted every year since 2002. And the percentage of persons aged 18 and up who are addicted to prescription pain pills has never been higher than 0.7% in any year. And depending on whose study you read, it could be anywhere from like under 1% to maybe 2 to 3%. The fact is that the drug warriors are always looking for a scapegoat. University of Pittsburgh School of Public Health came out with a study that I've talked about a lot in 2018. They were able to get government CDC data going back as far as 1979, and they concluded that the overdose rate has been on an exponential growth trend since 1979 and shows no evidence of slowing down. The only thing that's changed over the years is which particular drugs are more, predominant among the drugs that people are dying from. In the 80s, heroin was prominent. Then it became, Vicodin and that kind of thing in the 90s, and then became oxycodone in the early 2000s. Then it became heroin again, then fentanyl, and now tranq. They're looking for people to blame. Now, also, I did a study with two colleagues that got published in the Journal of Pain Research, where we showed that between the year 2002 and 2014, which the National Survey on Drug Use and Health changed its questionnaire after 2014. So rather than confuse things, we just stayed in that time frame. Past months non-medical use of prescription pain relievers by persons aged 12 and up was basically a flat line, unchanged, horizontal line. And past year diagnosed with prescription pain reliever use disorder. That was their terminology for persons 12 and up. Also unchanged, straight line. Meanwhile, between 2002 and 2014, the prescription volume per 100 persons, the number of prescriptions written per 100 persons, it first doubled and then came down 60% from 2012 to 2014. It actually came down less than 60% by 2014, but started coming down. So there's no correlation whatsoever between the number of prescriptions written and the number of people who get addicted or who non-medical use. Now, were doctors more liberally prescribing? Yeah, because we were under prescribing in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. And research was showing that, this has a very low addictive potential. And when used in an appropriate medical setting, you shouldn't hesitate to use it because you're making your patients suffer. And then, so we started liberalizing. And then as we started liberalizing, the more prescriptions written, the more are available to get diverted into the black market. So that became a popular drug of choice for non-medical users. On top of that, there's no question, and it's got a lot of publicity, which fueled the narrative. You had certain doctors who were definitely corrupt. Again, we talk about how prohibition corrupts. So, and particularly in Florida, there were these pain clinics, and there was a phenomenon called the Oxy Express, where drug dealers in Florida would fly people down from New York on their dime, tell them, go to this pain clinic, ask for this doctor, tell him these things. He'll give you a prescription for, let's say, 1,000 oxycodone. Then go to this pharmacy, but make sure you get this pharmacist. He'll fill it, then bring it to me. And so you had that. You had a doctor arrested at a Starbucks in Newport Beach, California. Everybody knew he goes there every Tuesday morning, and for $600 a piece, he writes a script for OxyContin to people. So, yeah, there were doctors who were basically using their medical license to be drug dealers. But I wouldn't blame it on the drug. I would blame it on prohibition, because everybody's corruptible. And when you're giving a doctor an opportunity to make, he can write 5 prescriptions, $600 a piece, made $3,000 in 20 minutes. That's pretty appealing. You don't have to talk to people in the office and put up with complaints and all that, and insurance companies. So, again, the narrative is these doctors hook people. Well, the population of people dying right now from fentanyl overdoses, these are not patients. In fact, that was the article that was in the Journal of Pain Research. It's called "Today's Non-Medical Users Are Not Yesterday's Patients." We didn't create them. Not only that, but more than 90% of overdoses are what they call polydrug. They usually, in the toxicology studies, they have other drugs in their system, including cocaine, which is the most common, or meth, or other psychostimulants, or alcohol. And I could tell you that when we prescribe medication for pain, we do not prescribe cocktails of cocaine and oxycodone. In fact, we tell them, don't take this with alcohol because it can get you, it potentiates it. Bad idea. Don't take this when you're drinking alcohol. That's what we tell our patients. So how are all these people who are overdosing from poly drugs patients? I don't know.
So you don't write a prescription with the suggestion, chase this down with a fifth of Jack Daniels. You don't
Right.
do that.
No.
That's not common practice.
No, it's not.
All right. Before I let you go, is there anything that you think we didn't cover that needs to be covered that's relevant to the topic?
No, I would just mention, anybody's interested in knowing about the history behind this what snafu as is called with the FDA. Like I say, you can go on time.com. There's a really interesting recounting of the history by Haley Weiss. And if you're interested in more about how this has gotten worse and worse, and the Iron Law of Prohibition, etc., I commend you to a white paper that came out in November 2022 by Trevor Burrus and me, called Cops Practicing Medicine. You could access it on the Cato website. Just go to cato.org, and you could put Cops Practicing Medicine in the search engine, or you can go to my bio page. It's there too. And I commend it to you because it's really interesting how we've seen this gradual encroachment since the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914.
Thank you so much. Now, do you have a website or anything that they can go to? I don't know, or a blog, Substack?
Well, if you go to the Cato website, cato.org, and all of the scholars there, including me, if on the very top of the page, there's like a drop-down menu. It says, I think it says experts, and then you drop down, you click on policy experts, and then all of us are listed in alphabetical order. And then you click on our picture, and it takes you to our page, which has everything we've ever blogged about and everything we've ever written, and even our multimedia appearances.
Oh, okay, great. Definitely, people, go check it out. Well, for now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Leibowitz. And any questions or any comments you have about this episode, please let me know. Thanks a lot. Till next time.